The day Olive Blackwell rode into Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, the summer of 1883, the sky above the mesa was the color of a bruise-healing purple at the edges, pale yellow at the center, and every soul in town who happened to be standing on the Main Street boardwalk that afternoon would later swear they felt something shift, though none of them could rightly say what. She came in on a buckboard wagon with a cracked left wheel and a mule that had clearly seen better decades. Her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had been pretty once, her dress the dusty brown of someone who had been traveling hard and long. She sat straight as a fence post on that wagon seat despite everything, her chin up, her green eyes scanning the street with the measured calm of a woman who had learned that showing fear only invited more of it. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse 3 days a week, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a small land office, a telegraph station, and a scattering of homes along the dirt roads that branched off the main street like veins from a heart. The population was somewhere around 200, depending on which miners had come down from the hills that week and which cowboys were passing through on their way to somewhere more promising. Olive pulled the mule up in front of the general store and sat there for a moment, consulting a letter she drew from her coat pocket. The letter was worn along its folds, soft from handling, and she read the address printed at the top with a quiet seriousness that suggested she had read it many times before. She climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone whose body was tired in a deep way, not just in the muscles but somewhere below that, and she tied the mule to the hitching post and pushed through the door of the general store. The man behind the counter was named Abe Prout, and he was a small man with large opinions, and he looked at Olive the way small men with large opinions often look at women who arrive alone in unfamiliar towns, with a mixture of curiosity and judgment that he wore openly on his face. "Help you," he said. "I am looking for the Blackwell homestead," Olive said. "I was told it is about 4 miles northeast of town. I want to make sure I have the right direction before I head out." Abe's expression shifted. Something in it became cautious. "You related to the Blackwells?" "Thomas Blackwell was my uncle," Olive said. "He passed in April. He left the property to me." Abe rubbed the back of his neck. "Yes, ma'am, that property, 4 miles northeast, just like you said. You follow the creek road out past the cottonwoods, take the fork left at the big split rock, and you will see the house from the road." He paused. "It has been sitting empty since Thomas passed, going on 3 months now." "I know," Olive said. "I came as soon as I could arrange things." She bought a small amount of provisions: flour, salt, dried beans, a tin of lard, a box of matches, and a length of candle, and she loaded them into the wagon and drove northeast out of Harlan Creek with the bruised sky turning darker above her and the dry wind pushing the smell of sage through the air. She did not know, as she drove out along the creek road, that the Blackwell property shared a fence line with the Stone Ranch. She did not know anything about Edgar Stone at all that afternoon. She was simply a woman of 26 who had come from Albuquerque with very little money and a piece of paper saying she owned 40 acres and a house in Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, and she intended to make something of it or die trying. And given the state of things back in Albuquerque, dying trying did not seem like the worst possible outcome. Edgar Stone was 32 years old and had lived on his ranch alone for 6 years, which is to say he had lived on his ranch alone since the spring of 1877, when his wife Clara had died of a fever that moved through the county and took 7 people with it before it exhausted itself. They had been married 2 years. They had been building something together, the ranch, a life, a future that had felt solid and real in the way that futures feel when you are young enough to believe in them completely. And then one Tuesday morning in April, Clara had been alive and warm beside him, and by the following Wednesday evening she was gone, and Edgar had been alone ever since. He was not a man who spoke much about this. He was not a man who spoke much about anything, which was a thing that had become more pronounced over the 6 years since Clara died. When you lived alone and worked alone and ate alone and slept alone, the habit of conversation became like a muscle that was never exercised, and it atrophied. And after long enough, it was difficult to remember that speaking to another person was something you had once done easily and without thought. Edgar ran cattle. He had about 60 head on 45 acres, and he managed them himself mostly, occasionally hiring a hand during roundup season. He was good at the work. He was good at most physical things: fencing, doctoring cattle, reading weather, tracking water. He had a lean, hard quality that came from years of outdoor work, dark hair going silver at the temples, hands that were rough and capable. His face was weathered but not unkind. People in Harlan Creek found him honest and reliable and absolutely impossible to get to know. He was mending a section of fence along the northeast boundary of his property on the afternoon that Olive Blackwell drove past on the creek road, and he straightened up from his work and watched the buckboard go by with the expression he gave most things: attentive but reserved, taking in information without offering any in return. He saw the cracked wheel. He saw the tired mule. He saw the woman driving, her back straight, her hat brim casting a line of shadow across her face. He watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend of the road, and then he went back to his fence. He assumed it was someone passing through to somewhere further on. He was wrong about that. Olive found the house in the state that houses find themselves when they have been empty for 3 months in a dry New Mexico summer. The porch boards were warped from the heat. A window pane on the east side had cracked, and something, a bird, from the look of it, had come in through the gap and built a rough nest on the kitchen shelf. The well pump needed priming. There were mouse tracks in the flour tin that Thomas had left behind, and the flour itself was ruined. The roof over the back bedroom had developed a leak that had left a dark stain on the floor, though there was no rain falling now to tell her how bad it was. Olive stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, cataloging everything, and there was a long moment where it all could have come apart, where the tiredness and the distance she had traveled and the sheer size of what needed doing could have broken through the composure she was carrying. But she was Thomas Blackwell's niece, and Thomas had been a stubborn man who believed that if you looked at a problem long enough, you found its solution, and Olive had inherited this from him along with the 40 acres. She set her provisions on the table. She chased the bird out through the broken window with a broom. She swept. She primed the pump, pulling up the handle with rhythmic force until the water came through brown and then cleared. She boiled water and cleaned the surfaces and swept the floor a second time and then a third. She found Thomas's tools in the small outbuilding beside the house and used a board from the back fence to patch the broken window temporarily. By the time the dark settled fully over the mesa and the stars came out enormous and numerous above the desert, Olive had made herself a small meal of salt pork and beans, eaten it alone at the kitchen table by the light of 2 candles, and made a list of everything that needed to be done in order for this place to sustain her through a year. The list was long. The money she had was not. She slept that night on the narrow bed in the front bedroom, and she slept solidly, the sleep of someone who has decided something and does not intend to undecide it. She met Edgar Stone the next morning. She was at the well pulling up water for the horses, her mule and the second horse she kept, a plain brown mare named Juniper, when she heard the sound of hooves and looked up to see a man on a dark gray horse coming along the fence line from the direction of the neighboring property. He came at a walk, not a hurry, and he stopped at the fence and looked at her from under the brim of a weathered hat. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Olive said. He looked at the house. He looked at the wagon still parked beside the porch. He looked at her. "You the Blackwell kin that Prout was talking about?" Olive set down the bucket. "I expect there was not much else to talk about yesterday." "Yes." "I am Olive Blackwell. Thomas was my uncle. I have taken over the property." "Edgar Stone," he said. "My ranch backs up to your east fence line." "Then you are my neighbor," Olive said. "Appears so." He studied the house with those careful eyes of his. "How did you find it?" "In need of work," Olive said, "but standing. I have made worse starts." Something moved in his expression that might have been the edge of a reaction, though it did not fully arrive. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Your pump was giving Thomas trouble last winter. Packing seal was cracked. If it starts drawing air again, that is what it is." "I will keep that in mind," Olive said. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat in a brief, formal gesture and turned the gray horse back along the fence line and rode away. That was the whole of their first conversation, and Olive watched him go with a thoughtful expression, and then she picked up her bucket and went back to her animals. She did not see him again for 4 days. Those 4 days were full. She drove into Harlan Creek and spoke to the man at the land office, a young fellow named Chester Hale, who confirmed her ownership of the property and helped her register it properly under her name. She visited the general store again and spent the bulk of her remaining money on the materials and supplies she most needed. She made arrangements with Abe Prout to run a small tab, which he agreed to with the wariness of a man who has been burned before but recognizes when he has no good reason to say no. She spoke to a woman named Ruth Garza, who she found working in the kitchen garden beside one of the homes off the main street. Ruth was a Mexican woman in her 40s who had lived in Harlan Creek for 15 years and knew everything about it. And she was the kind of person who assessed other people quickly and either opened herself to them or closed. And she opened to Olive within about 10 minutes of conversation. Ruth told her which ranchers to trust and which to be careful of, which townspeople were honest in their dealings and which were not, and she told her when Olive asked a little about Edgar Stone. "He keeps to himself," Ruth said, pressing soil around a pepper plant with her thumbs. "Has done since his wife died. 6 years now. He is a good man, honest as the day is long, does not drink, does not gamble, does not start trouble or look for it. But he is," she paused, searching for the right word, "sealed up, like a letter that has never been opened. He was different before, people say. I did not know him before. But people say his wife was a bright person, very warm, very alive, and when she died something in him just went behind a door and closed it." Olive was quiet for a moment. "He came by the day I arrived," she said, "to introduce himself. It was brief, but he seemed decent." "He is decent," Ruth said firmly. "There is no question of that. He just does not let people close, not anymore." Olive filed this information away with the same quiet efficiency she filed everything, and she drove back to the Blackwell homestead with her supplies and spent the next 3 days working on the roof, the fence, the front porch, and the interior of the house with a focused determination that left her exhausted and satisfied in equal measure each evening. On the 5th day of her time in Harlan Creek, while she was working on patching a section of the front fence, she heard the sound of something in the pasture to the east of her property line and looked up to find 3 of Edgar Stone's cattle had come through a gap in the shared fence and were now standing in what had been Thomas Blackwell's kitchen garden, eating the remnants of what had been, by the look of the straggling plants, a tolerably good squash bed. Olive set down her tools and walked to the east fence and assessed the gap. The bottom 2 rails had pulled free from the post on one side, leaving enough room for a determined animal to push through, which 3 of Edgar's animals had apparently done sometime in the night. She went back to the house and saddled Juniper and rode the fence line until she found Edgar Stone on his side of the property, working his own cattle in the near pasture. He saw her coming and pulled his horse around to face her as she reached the fence. "3 of your cattle are in my garden," Olive said without preamble. Edgar's jaw tightened briefly. "Which section?" "The southeast corner. Bottom 2 rails are off the post. Looks like it has been working loose for a while." He nodded once, already turning his horse. "I will get them out and fix the fence. I apologize for the damage to your garden." "The squash was already done," Olive said. "I want to put in a fall garden soon. I would appreciate the fence being solid before I do." "It will be solid by this afternoon," he said, and it was. She heard the sound of his hammer through the clear morning air for about an hour, and when she walked the fence line in the early afternoon, the repair was clean and tight, the post reset and the rails secured, and he had done a section of her fence that was adjacent to the break while he was at it, that she had not asked him to do. She thought about him a little after that. She could not help it. There was something about him, that quality Ruth had described, the sealed-up quality, that she found herself turning over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath, not because you expect treasure, but because the stone itself has an interesting shape and you want to understand it. She was not a romantic fool. She had not ridden 400 miles to find a husband. She had come to make something of 40 acres and a leaking house in the New Mexico territory, and that was her project and her intention, and she was not going to let her attention drift from it. But she was human. And she was 26, and had been alone in her own way for a good while, and Edgar Stone was a decent man with capable hands who had fixed her fence without being asked to go as far as he did, and these things registered. The first time she actually had a real conversation with him, a conversation that lasted more than 5 sentences, was about 2 weeks after she arrived. She was in the general store, and he came in while she was there, and they were both waiting while Abe located a specific order in the back, and the silence in the store stretched between them with the particular quality of a silence between two people who are aware of each other. Olive spoke first. "Have you had cattle in the territory long?" Edgar looked at her with mild surprise, as if the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. "About 9 years. Do you drive them north or sell locally?" "Drive north to the Cimarron market in the fall," he said. "Smaller sales locally through the year." Olive nodded. "I am thinking of putting in chickens, and maybe a milk cow. The garden and what I can grow should cover most of my food if I tend it right, but I need the income from something. I am considering whether cattle make sense on my acreage, or whether it is too small to be worth it." Edgar was quiet for a moment. She got the sense he was considering not engaging further, and then deciding, against some internal resistance, to answer properly. 40 acres is small for cattle, but not impossible if you run them carefully and do not overgraze. 2 or 3 head, maybe 4, could work on that land, but you would need to be able to move them off property for part of the season to keep the pasture healthy. "That is what I thought," Olive said. "Is there a communal grazing area in the territory?" "There is a section of federal land about 8 miles north. A few ranchers use it informally." He stopped. He seemed to be reaching the edge of what he had intended to say, and she could see him deciding about the next part. "I use it for overflow in the dry season. You would be welcome to run your animals alongside mine if you decide to get cattle." The offer surprised her. It was a more generous thing than she had expected from a man who was reportedly sealed up like an unread letter. "That is kind," she said sincerely. "I appreciate the offer." Abe came back with Edgar's order and the conversation ended, and they both went their separate ways. But Olive walked out to her wagon with the feeling that she had seen something underneath the stone. And what she had seen was not the absence of warmth, but its presence, carefully guarded, like a small fire kept from the wind. She bought 2 chickens the following week from a woman named Pearl Hobart who kept a farm to the south. And she bought a 3rd the week after, and she set about building a small chicken coop out of the lumber she had salvaged from the broken sections of fence. The coop was not elegant, but it was functional, and she felt genuinely pleased with it, a pleasure that was simple and physical and good. Edgar rode past one morning while she was putting the finishing touches on it. He stopped, looked at it, and said with the brevity that was his consistent register, "The latch wants to be higher. Coyotes will learn a low latch." Olive looked at the latch. She looked at the coyote trails she had noticed in the soft earth near the creek bank. "You are right," she said. She moved it. He watched her for a moment and then rode on. That became their pattern through the rest of that August and into September. Brief exchanges, practical information. He would tell her something useful about the land or the weather or the animals, offered without flourish, just a fact delivered like a tool passed from one hand to another. She would receive it in kind. Their conversations were short, but they accumulated, the way small stones accumulate into something you can stand on. She noticed that he never lingered. Whatever internal rule he had about proximity to other people, he held to it carefully, and she respected it. She was not a person who pushed herself where she was not wanted. But she was also not a person who was blind, and she saw, with increasing clarity, that Edgar Stone looked in the direction of her house sometimes when he was riding the fence line, with an expression she could not entirely read, but that did not look like indifference. The day that changed the quality of things between them came in late September, when the weather began to turn, and the evenings carried a sharp edge of cold that would deepen through the coming months. Olive had been in Harlan Creek for just over 6 weeks. She knew the rhythms of the town, now market day on Thursdays, the small church service on Sundays that she attended partly for spiritual reasons, and partly because it was one of the few social occasions available to a woman living alone on a remote property. She had made genuine friends in Ruth Garza and in Pearl Hobart, and she had become a familiar enough figure on the main street that people greeted her by name. She had also been keeping close watch on her finances, and the news was not good. The repairs to the house and the property had cost more than she had planned. The chickens were laying, but chickens took time to become profitable. The kitchen garden was producing, but a kitchen garden fed one person. It did not generate income. She had sold some mending work and some baking to a few households in town, which helped. But the cold months were coming, and with them, higher costs for wood and food, and the 100 small things that winter in the desert demanded. She was sitting at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with her ledger book open in front of her and her candle burning, and a cup of coffee cooling at her elbow. And she was doing the arithmetic for what felt like the 15th time, as if repeating the calculation might change the result, when she heard a knock at the door. She was surprised enough by this that she sat still for a moment before she went to answer it. People did not generally come to her door in the evening. Ruth and Pearl both lived in or near town. She took the lantern from the shelf and went to the door and opened it. Edgar Stone was standing on her porch. He had his hat in his hand, which was itself a small revelation. She had never seen him without his hat, and the gesture of holding it created an entirely different impression of him, something less armored. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she noticed because his shirts were usually dusty from work, and there was something in his expression that she had never seen there before. Not distress exactly, but uncertainty. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was now standing at the point where the decision had to be enacted and was finding it harder than he had expected. "Mr. Stone," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Miss Blackwell," he said, "I apologize for coming at this hour." "It is not late," she said. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said. "Then, I was at the Garza place this afternoon. Ruth Garza mentioned—" He stopped. He looked at the hat in his hands. He looked back at her. "She mentioned that you were short on supplies for the winter, that you were worried about the finances of the place." Olive felt a pulse of something, not quite embarrassment, not quite irritation, but a cousin of both. "Ruth has a generous heart," she said carefully, "and not always the best sense of what to share with whom." "She meant no harm," Edgar said quickly. "She was worried for you. She was asking me—" He stopped again, and she realized with dawning clarity that this was extremely difficult for him, and that he had come here anyway, which meant something. "I have more firewood than I need for the winter," he said, "cut and stacked. I was going to offer you a quart of it, and I have a side of beef from the steer I slaughtered last week, more than I can eat in a winter alone. I was going to ask if you would take some of it." The silence that followed this was a particular kind of silence. Olive looked at him steadily. He met her gaze and did not look away, though the effort of it was visible. "You did not have to come here and offer me that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you did." "Yes," he said. She considered him. The night around the porch was deep and full of stars and the smell of sage and the distant sound of coyotes talking to each other across the mesa. The lantern light fell across his face, and she could see the line of his jaw, the furrow in his brow, the hands holding the hat. "Thank you," she said. "I will accept the wood. The beef I will pay you for when I am able." "You do not have to pay for any of it," he said. "I will pay you when I am able," she repeated, and her tone made it clear this was not negotiable. Something in his face shifted, something that might have been respect or recognition or both. He nodded. "I will bring the wood over on Friday," he said. "I will be here," she said. He put his hat back on his head, touched the brim, and walked off the porch and into the darkness, and she heard the sound of his horse and then nothing, and she went back to her table and sat down. The ledger was still open in front of her. The arithmetic had not changed. But something else had slightly, in a way that she was not yet ready to name but that she could feel, the way you feel a change in the weather before the weather actually changes. He brought the wood on Friday, as promised. He came with a cart loaded with a cord of split wood, and he stacked it himself against the side of the house, which took the better part of 2 hours, and she helped him stack it, and they worked in a companionable quiet that had a different quality from the silence of strangers. They were not strangers anymore, exactly. They were something less defined and more interesting than that. When the wood was stacked, she went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and held one out to him. He looked at it for a moment and then took it. They sat on the porch steps because neither of them suggested anything else, and drank the coffee in the clear October morning while the light moved across the mesa in long gold angles. "This is good coffee," he said after a while. "Thomas kept his coffee equipment in better shape than the rest of the house," Olive said. "The grinder is good." "He was a particular man about certain things," Edgar said. There was something warmer in his voice when he spoke about Thomas, the ease of a memory that was fond. "He and I used to argue about fence posts. He was convinced you could use a green post if you let it sit right without drying it first. I told him it would warp." "Did it warp?" "Every time," Edgar said, "but he was proud, so he kept doing it the same way." Olive laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she had produced in this conversation, and it surprised her a little, and it surprised him more. He looked at her with an expression that was openly startled, and then his face did something it clearly had not done in a long time. A muscle at the corner of his mouth moved, and the edge of something that was close to a smile appeared, brief as a flash of light, and then was gone. But she had seen it. He was proud, she agreed. He was also the most loyal person I ever knew. When my parents died, I was 14. He took me in and never made me feel it was anything other than what he had always intended. He gave me everything he had, and now he has given me this place. There was something careful and tender in the way she said this that made Edgar look at his coffee cup. "He talked about you," he said. "Not often, but when he did it was always respectful. He was proud of you." Olive was quiet for a moment. "I did not know that," she said, in a voice that was softer than her usual register. "He was not a man who said that kind of thing directly." "Neither am I," Edgar said. And then he seemed to realize what he had offered with that, because he stood up abruptly and handed her the cup and said, "The side of beef is in the cart wrapped. You will want to get it into the cool cellar before noon." "Of course," Olive said. "Edgar," he stopped. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he registered it the way you register a sound that is unexpected in a quiet room. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the wood and the beef." She let the words carry what she meant, which was more than just those things, and from the look on his face he heard what she intended. "You are welcome," he said quietly. And he went to his cart and drove it back along the fence line toward his own property, and Olive watched him go with the coffee cup in both hands and the October sun warm on her face. Through November she saw him more regularly. Some of this was circumstance. Neighboring properties in a territory with limited social life will create overlap, but some of it was also choice, made on both sides without being acknowledged as choice. He would stop at her fence when he was riding the line. She would carry a cup of coffee to the fence when she saw him coming, which was a small act of deliberate welcome that she knew he understood, because his pace always slowed slightly when he came within sight of her house. They talked about the land, about the winter weather and what to expect, about the cattle markets and what prices were likely to do in the spring. about the territory and its politics, which were considerable. New Mexico Territory in 1883 was a place of great tension between the old land-grant families, the Anglo-ranchers who had come in over the previous decades, and the native peoples whose land all of this had been not so long before. Edgar spoke about these tensions with a careful fairness that Olive found striking. He did not minimize the dispossession that had occurred. He spoke about the Apache families who had been removed from the lands east of Harlan Creek, with a plainness that acknowledged wrong without getting tangled in the complex emotions that many men in the territory wore around the subject. "My father came from Virginia after the war," he told her one afternoon at the fence, the cold November wind pushing at their hats. "He homesteaded 60 miles north of here. When I was a boy, there was still considerable conflict in this territory, Apache and Comanche both. I was old enough to understand what was happening, and most of what I understood was that nobody in it was behaving well, including us." "There are not many men in this territory who would say that," Olive said. "There are not many men in this territory who thought hard enough about it," he said. Olive looked at him. "You are not what I expected when I arrived," she said before she could decide whether to say it. His eyes met hers. "What did you expect?" "I am not sure," she said honestly. "A harder person, maybe. People told me you were closed, reserved." "I am reserved," he said. "You are," she agreed. "But you are not hard. There is a difference." Something passed through his expression that she could not entirely name, something that was moved and also slightly pained, like a thing that had been numb being touched and feeling the sensation return. He looked away from her at the distant line of the mesa. "It has been a long time," he said, "since someone said anything like that to me." She did not push it. She understood that he had offered something, and the right response was not to take hold of it but to simply acknowledge it and let him have the choice of what came next. What came next happened on the first Thursday in December. Olive had been in town for market day, and she had come back in a mood that was harder to shake than usual. The reason was a man named Garrett Webb, who was one of the larger landholders in the county and who had made her an offer that week, through a third party, for her 40 acres at a price that was insultingly low. This was the second such offer in 3 months. The first had been made through Chester Hale at the land office, and Olive had declined it and thought that was the end of it. The second came through Webb himself, who stopped her on the main street of Harlan Creek and said, in the tone of a man who has not been told no often enough to believe it, that she ought to think carefully about her situation. A woman alone in the territory, winter coming, and his offer was the best she was likely to receive. Olive had told him, with a precision and a composure that cost her considerably, that she was not interested, and she had gone about her business in town and driven home with the cold December wind in her face and a steady anger settled in her chest like a coal. She was at her kitchen stove when Edgar came to the door, and she called him in with a curtness that she immediately regretted when she saw his expression adjust to it. "I am sorry," she said, turning from the stove. "I have had a trying day. Come in." He stepped inside, which he had not done before. Their exchanges had always been on the porch or at the fence, and the interior of the small house received him. He looked around the room with the expression of a man who had not been inside another person's home in a long time and was somewhat unsettled by the intimacy of it. The house was warm from the stove and smelled of the stew Olive was cooking, and there was a cloth on the table and candles and small evidence of her life everywhere, books stacked by the window, a piece of mending on the chair, her ledger open on the side table. "I came to tell you there is a storm coming down from the north," he said. "Should be here by Saturday morning. You will want to make sure your animals are secured and your wood is close to the house." "Thank you," she said. She turned back to the stove and stirred the pot. The smell of the stew filled the room. Potatoes and beef and herbs from the dried bundles she kept on a string near the window. She moved then, with a naturalness that would surprise her later when she thought about it, to the shelf where the plates were. She took down one plate, and then, without pausing, without deliberating, without asking, she took down a second plate and set it on the table beside the first. She set out the 2 plates and the 2 forks, and she ladled the stew into both bowls and put the bread she had baked that morning on a board between them, and she sat down. Edgar had not moved from just inside the door. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said, simply, not as a command and not as a question, just the words. He looked at the table. He looked at the 2 plates. He looked at her. The expression on his face was something she had never seen on it before, something that was not quite distress, but was in the same family, something that was being reached by the sight of that second plate in a way that clearly went deep and far back. He did not object. He crossed the room and pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down, and she poured coffee into both cups and they ate. He had not eaten a meal with another person in 6 years. The fact of it settled over him as he sat there, and it was almost unbearable in its simplicity. The clinking of 2 forks, the sound of someone else breathing across the table, the warmth of the room and the smell of the food and the soft light of the candles, things that the world was full of, that most people passed through without noticing. He had not noticed them when Clara was alive. He had spent 6 years refusing them. And now they were here again, just the small, ordinary facts of a shared table, and something in him that had been held very tightly for a very long time was loosening. And it hurt, the way circulation hurts when it returns to something that has been cold. Olive told him about Garrett Webb. She told it plainly, without dramatics, just the sequence of events, the low offer and the tone and the implication. When she got to the part about what he had said, a woman alone in the territory, she said it with a flat quality that was more expressive than anger would have been. Edgar set down his fork. "Webb is the kind of man who hears no and treats it as the opening position in a negotiation," he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness that was not. "I had that impression," Olive said. "He has bought out 3 smaller properties in the last 2 years," Edgar said. "The Henning place, the old Sodo Grant, the land east of the Copper Spur. He is building something. I do not know what yet, but he is building it." "He is not getting my property," Olive said. "No," Edgar said with a flatness that matched hers and amplified it. They ate. The stove cracked and settled. Outside, the wind was picking up ahead of the storm he had warned her about, moving through the sage with a long whisper. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 6 weeks. 7 now," she said. "You have done a great deal with this place in 7 weeks," he said. The quality in his voice was plain admiration, and it was plainly sincere. "I had to," she said. "It was that or give up, and I did not ride 400 miles to give up." "Where did you come from originally?" he asked. "Tennessee," she said. "My parents had a farm outside of Nashville. My father died when I was 12, my mother 2 years later. Thomas was already out here by then. He came for me and brought me west." She was quiet for a moment. "I was with him until I was 20, and then there was a man." She paused, and he waited, and she continued. "There was a man in Albuquerque. I married him when I was 21. His name was James Blackwell. He was no relation. It was coincidence on the name. He was not a cruel man. I want to be fair. He was just not what I thought he was, and I was not what he needed. And by the time we understood that it was too late and we had given 4 years to it, that neither of us got back." She said this without bitterness, or rather with a bitterness that was old and settled, the kind you have made peace with. "He died?" Edgar asked. "No," she said. "He left, went to California in 1880. I stayed in Albuquerque, took in sewing and mending, kept myself, wrote to Thomas once a month. When he died and the lawyer sent the letter about this place, I was on the road in a week." She looked at him across the candles. "What about you?" It was a risk asking him. She could see him feel it. But he answered. He told her about Clara. He told her simply and without the kind of protective distance that she might have expected from him. He told her about meeting Clara in Santa Fe in 1874, about the 2 years they had before she died, about the fever that took her. He told it in the same plain, careful way that he brought things to the fence, offered like a tool, and she understood that he had not told this to anyone in a long time, and that the telling of it was itself a form of the circulation returning to the cold thing, and she received it with the same quiet care. "I am sorry," she said, when he finished. It was a long time ago, he said. The phrase came out with the mechanical quality of something he had said before, a habit, and then he seemed to hear it himself because his expression shifted. I used to say that and mean, I do not know, that it was behind me, but it is not behind you. Things like that are not behind you. They are just inside you. They become part of the structure. Olive looked at him across the table. In the candlelight, his face was open in a way she had not seen it before, the habitual guardedness softened by the warmth of the room and the food and the conversation and something else, something that was between them and had been for a while, gathering like weather. Yes, she said, that is exactly what it is, part of the structure. They sat with that for a moment. Then he said, this is the best stew I have had in. He stopped. In a long time, he finished. You are welcome to it any time, she said, and she meant it simply as the practical offer it was. But they both understood it was not simple. He left before dark with the wind picking up around the porch, and he stood there for a moment before he went down the steps, and he looked at her in the doorway with the lantern behind her, and he said, "Thank you, Olive." It was the first time he had used her given name. She held it after he was gone, stood in the doorway with the cold wind coming in and held the sound of it, and then she went inside and cleared the 2 plates from the table. The storm he had warned her about came on Saturday morning, a serious desert cold front that brought wind and freezing rain, and by the afternoon, a thin dusting of snow that lay white and unexpected over the brown mesa. Olive kept the stove burning and stayed close to the house, checking the animals every few hours, making sure the chicken coop was holding against the wind. On Sunday morning, when the storm had passed and the air was brilliant and cold, and the snow was already melting off the rocks in the hard December sun, she walked the fence line to assess the damage and found Edgar doing the same on his side. They walked the line together on their respective sides, calling to each other across the fence about which posts had shifted and which sections needed attention, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and they were both aware of how natural it was, and neither of them said anything about it. He had brought tools, so had she. They repaired the fence together, each working on their own side, handing tools back and forth over the rails, and the morning passed in this way, in the cold, clear winter sunlight with their breath making small clouds in the air. "I want to put in a root cellar in the spring," Olive said, wrestling a post back into its proper angle. "The existing one is too shallow. It does not keep things cold enough through the summer." "I know where you could get good stone for it," Edgar said. "There is a dry creek bed about a mile north that has flat limestone, good for cellar walls." "Would you show me?" A pause, a brief one, but she caught it. "Yes," he said. They finished the fence and she made coffee again and they drank it on the porch in the cold, their coats buttoned, and the conversation was easier now, looser, the meal the previous week having shifted something in the ground between them. "There is a Christmas social at the church on the 22nd, she said after a while. "Ruth is organizing the music. She told me about it." "I know about it," he said. "Do you go?" "I have not," he said. In some years she waited. "I might go this year," he said. She did not let herself smile where he could see it. She looked out at the snow-dusted mesa and kept her expression ordinary. "It would be nice to know someone there," she said mildly. He looked at her from the side. "You know Ruth and Pearl and half the town by now," he said, with the dry accuracy that she was learning was his particular form of gentle humor. "I do," she admitted, "but none of them are my neighbor." This was a small and unremarkable thing to say, and it landed on him like sunlight which she could see. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I will see you at the social then," he said. He did come to the Christmas social on the 22nd of December, 1883, and he stood out from the crowd in the small church not because there was anything showy about him but precisely because there was not. He was dressed cleanly and he wore his hat until he came inside, and then he held it, and he stood near the back wall with the particular stillness of a man who is somewhere unfamiliar and staying close to the edge of the room. Olive found him within 5 minutes. She came to stand beside him and they watched the room together, Ruth Garza at the front with her guitar filling the space with something warm and lilting, children running between the legs of their parents, the smell of pine boughs and wood smoke, and the food that everyone had brought. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said, as if this were obvious, which for him it was. He did what he said he would do and nothing else was thinkable. They stayed together through most of the evening, which did not go unnoticed in Harlan Creek. Ruth caught Olive's eye from across the room and looked extremely pleased with herself. Chester Hale came to say hello and made the kind of conversation that people make when they are actually assessing a situation, and Olive handled it gracefully and Edgar handled it with his usual economy of words. At one point Garrett Webb came through the door, and he saw Olive immediately, and his gaze moved from her to Edgar beside her and back, and something in his face recalculated. He did not approach them. He went to the other side of the room and stayed there. Olive noted it. "He reconsidered," she said quietly to Edgar. Edgar had been watching Webb from the moment he entered. "He is smart enough to read a room," he said. "What does the room say in his reading?" Olive asked, curious. "That you are not alone," Edgar said simply. She looked at him then, and he was looking at the room still, not at her, but the line of his jaw was set with a certainty that was not aggressive but was unmistakably firm. He had placed himself beside her, not as a declaration but as a simple fact, and the fact was visible to everyone who cared to look. Something shifted in her chest. Something that had been building quietly through the 7 weeks since she arrived, through the fence and the wood and the beef and the stew and the plates and the storm and the fence again and the coffee on the porch, all of it accumulating with a patience that was not calculation but simply the natural weight of one thing after another. It shifted, and what it shifted into was a clarity, clean and certain, about what she felt. She did not say anything about it that evening. She was not a person who said things until she was ready to say them truly, and there were still questions between them, still that sealed-up quality in him that she did not know the full shape of, still the 6 years he had spent building walls, still the care she knew she needed to have for a thing that was fragile in the way that new growth is fragile, not weak, but easily broken by carelessness. They walked out of the church together into the cold December night, the stars immense above the territory, the smell of mesquite smoke from the chimneys of Harlan Creek. "I will drive you home," he said, not a question. "My wagon is here," she said. "I know," he said. "I will ride alongside." She looked at him. He was looking at the dark road ahead, as if it were a practical matter and nothing else. She understood that for him it was practical and also much more than practical, and that the combination of those things was how he navigated toward her through the practical, along the surface of what could be said plainly, toward what lay beneath. "All right," she said. They drove and rode together under the December stars, and he saw her to her door and waited until the lamp inside was lit, and she called out that she was well. And then she heard his horse on the road going home. She spent the last days of December and the first days of the new year, 1884, in a quiet that was different from the quiet of the months before. It had a warmth in it now. The property no longer felt like a solitary project. The fence line between her place and Edgar's felt less like a boundary and more like a seam, the place where two things joined. She thought about him more than was entirely reasonable. She thought about the way he had fixed her fence without being asked. The way he had come to her door at night with his hat in his hand. The way he had sat across from her at the table and eaten the stew. The way he had said her name. In the second week of January she was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she heard him at the east fence, and she walked over, her breath misting in the morning cold, the eggs warm in her basket. He was standing at the fence, and he was not holding a tool or leading an animal. He was just standing there. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He was looking at the ground, and then he looked up at her. "I have been wanting to say something," he said, "and I am not practiced at this kind of saying, but I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve that." She held the egg basket and waited. "I think a great deal of you," he said. The words came out with the careful precision of a man who has chosen each one individually. "I thought of you through the whole of December. I think of you when I am working and when I am—" He stopped. He pressed forward. "When I am sitting alone in the evening, which I have done every evening for 6 years, I used to not mind it. I do not find I want it in the same way any more. That is your doing." Olive's chest was very full. "Edgar," she said, "I am not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I am not. I want you to know that I understand your situation. You came here to build something. You do not need complications. I am not presenting myself as something you must deal with." "Edgar," she said again. He stopped. "Are you finished?" she asked. A pause. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, "because I want to say something plainly also. I have cared about you since the morning you fixed the extra section of fence that I had not asked you to fix. I did not know what to do with it immediately. I do now." She looked at him steadily across the fence. "I would like very much if you would court me properly. I do not require grand gestures. I require honesty and consistency, which you already have in abundance. I would like the chance to know you better, and I would like you to know me." He stood very still on his side of the fence. The cold winter light was coming sideways across the mesa, and it fell on his face, and what was on his face was something she could not entirely describe, but which made her feel with absolute certainty that she had said the right thing. "Olive," he said. His voice was rough. "Yes," she said. "That is—" He paused. "That is the best thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." "Then you should probably come to dinner on Saturday," she said, "and we can begin from there." He came to dinner on Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. The winter of 1884 in the New Mexico Territory was cold but not brutal, and it passed over Olive's property and Edgar's ranch with the specific texture of a winter that is endured in good company. The cold still real, the work still hard, but with a warmth running through it that was interior and therefore constant. Edgar came for dinner most Saturdays, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings when the work allowed, and Olive went to his ranch on Sunday afternoons, where he showed her the operation of the place with a careful thoroughness, teaching her as if she were a student and he were honored to have her. She learned his cattle by sight, learned the names of the feed pastures, learned the particular quality of the spring that fed his water tank. She sat at his table, a spare thing, one chair on each side, and they ate meals that he cooked with a simplicity and a competence that reflected his general character. He was not a man of many words, but she had always been a person who understood that words were not the only language, and she learned his. The way he positioned himself between her and anything he perceived as a threat, physical or social. The way he listened when she spoke with a quality of attention that was the deepest form of respect she knew. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, with an expression that was undefended and open and full of something that neither of them had yet said the direct word for. Ruth Garza watched all of this with a satisfaction that she expressed in the most pointed and affectionate possible way. "He is building a new room on the back of his house," she told Olive in February with a face of perfect innocence. "Is he?" Olive said. "A larger bedroom," Ruth said, still perfectly innocent. "And I noticed he has been whitewashing the main room, which it has never been whitewashed in the memory of anyone in Harlan Creek. He likes things neat," Olive said composedly. Ruth Garza laughed so hard she had to put down her coffee. It was on a Sunday in early March, the kind of New Mexico March day that could not decide if it was still winter or finally spring, when Edgar took Olive to the dry creek bed he had told her about, to show her the limestone for the root cellar she was planning. They rode out together on horseback, Olive on Juniper and Edgar on his gray, and the morning was clear and cold with the light coming hard and bright across the desert, and the limestone was exactly as he had described, flat, good quality, easy to work. They sat on the rock shelf above the dry creek bed and ate the lunch she had packed, cold biscuits and dried beef, and the early spring apples that Abe Pruitt had gotten in from a shipment, small and sharp-tasting but real fruit after the winter, and the value of that was considerable. Edgar was sitting beside her, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, which was the kind of proximity that had been building for months the way pressure builds, gradually and then all at once. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "When Clara died," he said, "I told myself it was the last time, not in a dramatic way. I did not say it in words. I just closed. I told myself I was fine alone, that I had everything I needed, that the ranch was enough. And for a long time I believed it." He turned the apple in his hand. "I stopped eating with anyone, stopped wanting to. It seemed like something that required too much, sitting across from someone, seeing someone else's face." He paused. "When you set that second plate down in November without asking something, I do not have a clean word for it. Something happened that I had not expected." Olive was very quiet. "It was not just the plate," he said. You did it like it was obvious, like it was simply the thing that was done. And I had been telling myself for 6 years that it was not the thing that was done anymore, not for me. And you just ignored that without even knowing about it and set the plate down." "I am glad I did," she said. He looked at her. The March light was in his eyes, and those eyes were dark and serious and completely open, no guard, nothing between them. "I love you, Olive," he said. "I want you to know that I know what I am saying. It is not something I say without understanding its full weight." The sound of the creek bed in the silence, which had no water but had wind, the sage, the far mountains, the smell of the cold stone they were sitting on. "I love you," she said back to him. Exactly the same way he had said it, plainly, with full weight. He reached across and took her hand, which was the first time he had held her hand, and his hand was large and rough and warm, and she held it, and they sat like that above the limestone bed, with the spring light moving around them and the territory wide and open in every direction. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday morning in late April, at her kitchen table, over the coffee that had become the cornerstone of their mornings together. He pulled a ring from his coat pocket, a simple band of silver, small and plain, that had belonged to his mother, and he set it on the table between the 2 coffee cups and looked at her and said, "I think you know what I want to ask. I want to ask it properly." Olive looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Ask it then," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I want you to be my wife, Olive. I want to build this life with you. I want to eat every meal at a table that has 2 plates." She picked up the ring and looked at it for a moment, turning it in the morning light. Then she held out her left hand. He put the ring on her finger with the careful hands of a man who was enormously aware of what he was doing, and she turned her hand to look at it, the silver plain and perfect in the morning light, and she looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He leaned forward across the table and kissed her, his first kiss of her, a thing that had been coming for months, and arrived with the unhurried certainty of water finding its level. And she put her hand on the side of his face, and felt the rough, weathered warmth of him, and kissed him back. They were married in June of 1884, in the small church in Harlan Creek, with Ruth Garza playing guitar and Pearl Hobart crying with the comfortable openness of a woman who cries at weddings and makes no apology for it. Chester Hale was there, and Abe Prout, and about 60 other residents of the town and the surrounding territory, because Olive Blackwell had made herself known and beloved in the 9 months she had been in Harlan Creek, and Edgar Stone, to the general delight of everyone who knew him, had evidently come back from wherever he had been for 6 years. Garrett Webb did not attend. He had made one final attempt at acquiring the Blackwell property in March, approaching Olive directly at the land office with a revised and somewhat higher offer, and she had declined it again, this time with Edgar standing beside her at the counter, not saying anything, simply present, and Webb had looked at the 2 of them and left without further argument. He had not troubled her again. The wedding was simple and warm and true. Edgar stood at the front of the church in a clean suit that fit him well and looked at Olive coming down the aisle with the expression of a man who cannot believe his good fortune and also absolutely can, and she walked toward him in the white dress she had made herself over the previous 2 months, her dark hair down for the occasion, her green eyes bright and steady. They said their vows in the plain language of the time, honest and clear, and when it was done and they had kissed and turned to face the room together, Ruth struck up something jubilant, and the whole small church was full of warmth. After the wedding they went back to Olive's house, which had become, with the improvements of the past months, a genuinely good house. The roof repaired, the porch solid, the rooms clean and warm and full of the evidence of a life being well made. Edgar brought his few possessions from his ranch and moved into the Blackwell house, because the Blackwell house was larger, and because Olive had her garden and her chickens and her root cellar and her systems all built around it, and it made sense, and Edgar was a practical man who did not let sentiment get in the way of sense. His ranch they continued to operate together. She learned the cattle work alongside him with the same focused competence she brought to everything, and he taught her with the same quality of attention that had characterized everything. He had given her complete, unhurried, respectful of what she could do. The root cellar they built together through that first summer of their marriage, digging it out with picks and shovels in the hot June mornings, lining it with the limestone from the dry creek bed, fitting it with a good door and proper ventilation, and deep enough shelves to hold a serious winter's worth of provisions. On the day they finished it, Edgar stood in it and looked around with his hands on his hips and a satisfaction on his face that was wholly genuine. "Good," he said. "Very good," Olive said from behind him, looking over his shoulder. She put her hand on his arm and he turned and looked at her with that open expression that was still, months after she had first seen it, the most remarkable thing she knew. "You want something in there already," he said, correctly reading her face. "The early squash is ready," she said, "and the onions." He shook his head, but the movement contained a smile that he no longer tried to suppress. He had been smiling more and more easily over the past months, and every time she saw it, she felt the same satisfaction she had felt when the first cold water had come clear from the Blackwell well, the sense of something restored. That autumn, he drove his cattle north to the Cimarron market and came back with a good price and enough to carry them through the winter and put some aside. Olive had her chickens laying steadily and had begun selling eggs in town, and she had taken on a small amount of the careful mending work she was skilled at, not because they needed the money, but because she liked having her own earnings distinct from the ranch income, liked the independence of it, and Edgar understood this and respected it without needing it explained. Ruth Garza came to dinner with her husband Vicent on an October evening, and the four of them ate at the table that now seated four comfortably, and the conversation went long into the night, and when the Garzas left and Edgar was washing the dishes and Olive was drying them, he said, "We should do that more often." She looked at him with the dish towel in her hands. He was speaking about having people to dinner, something he had not done in 6 years. "Yes," she said, "we should." He passed her a wet plate and their hands touched briefly in the exchange, and he smiled at her over the stack of dishes, a full real smile, and it was, she thought, the best thing she had ever seen. By November of 1884, she knew she was pregnant, which she had suspected for 2 weeks before she confirmed it with certainty to herself. And then she told Edgar on a Sunday morning over breakfast, simply and directly, because that was how she did things. He was holding his coffee cup and looking out the kitchen window at the early snow on the mesa when she said, "Edgar, we are going to have a child." He went very still. His cup went down on the table with a careful movement. He turned to look at her, and his face was open was not a large enough word. It was as if everything he had ever sealed away was now present on the surface, all of it at once, joy and fear and grief and love and something vast and overwhelmed that had no single name. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He rose from his chair, and she rose from hers, and he held her with the careful intensity of a man who has just been handed something he understands is the most precious thing he has ever been trusted with, and she held him back with equal strength because she was Olive Blackwell and she did not hold back in anything she did. "I am afraid," he said into her hair, meaning the fear of loss, meaning Clara, meaning the possibility of loving again and having it taken. "I know," she said. "I'm a little afraid, too, but I am more glad than afraid by a considerable distance." She felt him breathe. "Yes," he said, "so am I. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was a good one. Hard in the way that all New Mexico winters were hard, cold and dry and demanding in their particular physical way, but good underneath all of that. The Blackwell house was warm. The cattle were sound. The chickens were laying through the cold, which was a small miracle of the coop Edgar had improved with extra insulation in October. The root cellar was full. There was always enough on the table, which there had been for Olive most of her life, but not always, and the fact of sufficiency was something she felt with a daily gratitude that did not become ordinary. Edgar had taken down the walls he had built. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic act, but gradually, the way ice thaws first at the edges, then more and more toward the center, until one day you realize that what was frozen is moving freely. He talked now. Not extravagantly, he was still himself, still the man of few words and careful choices, but with a warmth and an ease that people in Harlan Creek noted with the quiet pleasure that a community takes when one of its own comes back to life. He talked to Vicent Garza about politics and land and cattle. He talked to Chester Hale about the upcoming territorial legislature. He went to the Christmas social again, and this time he did not stand at the back wall. He sat with Olive at one of the tables near the front, and when Ruth started the music he watched with the open face of a man who is present in his own life. He and Olive talked, long and freely, through the evenings by the fire about everything, the territory and its changes, about their pasts and their plans, about what they wanted for the child coming, about small things and large things alike. He had opinions, she discovered, that were thoughtful and strongly held. He had humor that was dry and perfectly timed. He had a capacity for wonder at small things, a hawk on a fence post, the particular color of the February sky, the engineering of a well-made door hinge, that she found wholly charming and wholly consistent with who he was. Their son was born in the early morning of June 3rd, 1885, with Ruth Garza in attendance as midwife and the New Mexico dawn coming pink and gold through the bedroom window. He was healthy and large, and declared his presence immediately with a good strong cry that bounced off the walls of the room and went out through the open window into the warm June morning. Edgar had been in the hallway, because Ruth had sent him there with the implacability of a woman who has delivered a great many children and knows exactly where fathers should and should not be. And when Ruth called him in and he stood in the doorway and saw Olive in the bed with the child in her arms, he made a sound that was not quite a word and crossed the room in 3 steps. Olive watched him look at his son. Watched the look on his face, something so complete and so deeply, privately his that she felt like a privilege to witness it. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks red and angry," Edgar said, which was true, and also the first joke he had made in the presence of a newborn, and she laughed. "What shall we name him?" she said. "Thomas," Edgar said without hesitation. She had not expected that. She felt the name land in her chest with the weight of everything it carried, the uncle who had brought her to this place, who had given her the house, who had made this whole sequence of events possible. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Edgar Stone was baptized at the Harlan Creek Church 3 weeks later, Ruth and Vicent Garza standing as godparents, the whole community turning out with the generosity that communities produce for births and marriages, food and small gifts, and the genuine warmth of shared joy. The ranch grew through the summer of 1885 and into the following years. Edgar expanded the cattle operation, and Olive ran the garden and the chickens, and eventually added a small dairy operation with 2 milk cows, which sold steadily in Harlan Creek and proved more profitable than she had initially projected. They worked together, and they worked well together, with the specific compatibility of people who are individually capable and have the good sense to recognize and use each other's capabilities without competition. Garrett Webb, in the spring of 1886, made what turned out to be his final play for consolidating land in the Harlan Creek area, attempting to buy out several small holders through a combination of pressure and low offers. The community organized against him, led in large part by Edgar and Vicent Garza and Chester Hale, who had by then developed a good sense of what Webb was building: a monopoly on water access in the South County, which would have given him effective control over every ranching operation in the area. They took the matter to the Territorial Land Office and made the case clearly, and the resulting investigation found enough irregularities in Webb's previous purchases to slow his expansion considerably. He left the county within the year, which was the kind of ending that was not entirely satisfying but was satisfying enough. Thomas took his first steps in September of 1886, walking from the kitchen table to Edgar's knees with the triumphant and slightly terrified expression of a person who has discovered a new form of locomotion. Edgar caught him when he tipped forward and held him upright and looked at Olive over the child's head with an expression of pure, simple happiness that she kept in a place inside herself, alongside all the other things she kept there. The inventory of their life together, each item valuable, each one adding to the weight and warmth of the whole. She found out she was pregnant again in the winter of 1887, and this time Edgar received the news with less fear and more joy, the proportion having shifted with the evidence of what survived. "Another one," he said, not as a question but as a statement, with a quality of wonder that had not diminished. "Another one," she confirmed. He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand, and she turned hers to hold his properly, and they sat like that for a while in the morning quiet with Thomas playing on the kitchen floor between them, making the determined sounds of a child engaged in something important. Their daughter was born in August of 1887, and they named her Clara. Edgar held her in the first hours of her life with a reverence that was different in quality from the reverence he had brought to holding Thomas older, more complex, weighted with the name she carried and what it meant. Olive watched his face very carefully in those moments, checking, and what she saw there was not grief displacing joy but grief and joy together, which was not the same thing and was in fact better because it meant he was carrying it all, not choosing between. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your nose," Olive said, which was true and also somewhat funny given the relative sizes involved, and he laughed, a full laugh, a laugh that rang in the room and startled baby Clara into widening her eyes and then subsiding back into the satisfaction of the newly fed. They were four. They were a family. The Blackwell homestead had become the Stone Ranch, or rather it had become both simultaneously. The properties formally combined in the summer of 1886 into a single operation of 85 acres that they worked together as one enterprise, the fence between them gone, the land open and continuous as it should be. The house was extended that summer too, Edgar adding 2 rooms to the back with the same competence he brought to all construction, and the house became a real house, a proper family house with space to breathe and room for the children and for guests, and Olive made it a home with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything she made. She had a garden that was famous in Harlan Creek by the summer of 1887, the most productive kitchen garden in the county, and she supplied several families in town with vegetables and herbs and the dried goods she preserved. And the income from this, added to the dairy and the chickens and the cattle, made the Stone operation comfortable in a way that had not been guaranteed when she arrived on that buckboard with the cracked wheel in the summer of 1883. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1887, when the territory was doing that thing it did in the fall, turning the light to gold and the air to something perfect, Olive and Edgar sat on the rebuilt porch of the house that had once been Thomas Blackwell's, with Clara asleep in the basket between their chairs and Thomas running in large circles in the front yard for reasons that were entirely clear to himself. And the evening was settling golden over the mesa. 4 years ago tomorrow, Olive said. Edgar turned to look at her. Your anniversary of arriving, he said. I came in from the east, she said, on the creek road with a cracked wheel and a mule, and the sky was the color of a bruise, and I had no idea where I was or what I was doing or whether any of it would work. Did you have doubts, he said, about the property, she thought. Not really. About surviving the first winter, maybe. About being alone, she looked at him. Did you have doubts when you came to my door that night in November with your hat in your hand? He was quiet for a moment. I had fear, he said. Doubt is when you do not know the right thing. Fear is when you know the right thing and are afraid of it anyway. He looked at the mesa. I knew the right thing. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He turned his hand and held hers. Thomas stopped his circling and came to lean against Edgar's knee, looking up at him with the complete confidence of a small person who has never had reason to doubt his welcome. Edgar put his free hand on the boy's head, and the boy leaned into it and then immediately ran off again, because he was two and motion was the fundamental condition of existence. I think, Olive said, that this is the happiest I have ever been. Edgar looked at her. The gold light was on his face, and the face that had been sealed and locked when she arrived had been open for a long time now, and what was on it was everything love and gratitude, and the particular quality of a person who knows what loss is and therefore knows what this is. Yes, he said, this is the happiest I have ever been. They sat on the porch in the autumn evening, the two of them, the baby in her basket, the boy running, the territory gold and wide around them, and the table inside had 2 plates on it and 2 cups, and tomorrow it would have a 4th small plate pushed close to the edge and a 3rd small cup beside it. And there was no question, none at all, about how many plates would always be on that table from now until the end of their days. The years that followed were full years. Full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows that the territory and the time and the nature of human life distributed fairly across everyone, but full of the substance that makes difficulty bearable and sorrow temporary. Edgar taught Thomas to ride when the boy was 4, putting him up on the gray horse with the solemnity of a ceremony, walking the horse in slow circles in the yard, while Thomas gripped the saddle horn with both hands and the expression of concentrated effort that was so like his father's that Olive, watching from the porch, felt her heart make a movement that was half amusement and half something much larger. Clara grew up with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and the combination was formidable. She walked at 10 months and talked at 11, and by the time she was 3 she had opinions about the organization of the kitchen that she expressed with a clarity that made Ruth Garza, visiting for Sunday dinner, look at Olive with an expression of delighted recognition. She is exactly like you, Ruth said. She is, Olive agreed, with equal amounts of pride and apprehension. Ruth and Vicent came to Sunday dinner regularly through those years, and Pearl Hobart came too, and Chester Hale after he married a woman named Louise who came from Colorado and took to Harlan Creek, and to Olive's friendship with the ease of a plant in good soil. The table that had held 2 plates in the fall of 1883 held 6 or 8 or 10 on Sunday evenings, and Edgar sat at the head of it, and moved through these gatherings with an ease that still sometimes surprised him when he caught himself at it, the ease of a man who had come back to himself, all the way back. He and Olive talked about this one night after the children were asleep and the house was quiet and they were sitting by the fire with the late autumn wind moving outside, and he said, I want you to know that I understand what you did. She looked at him. What did I do? You set the plate down, he said. And you kept setting it every time without asking whether it was wanted, without requiring anything. You just set it down. He looked at the fire. It sounds like a small thing when I say it that way. But it was not a small thing. It was not a small thing, she agreed, but it also was not a strategy. I set it down because you were there and the stew was made, and it seemed like the obvious thing. It seemed like simply what was done. "I know," he said. "That is what made it work." He turned from the fire to look at her. "If it had been a strategy or charity or pity, I would have felt it and I would have left. But it was none of those things. It was just you, acting naturally, as if it were already true that I was supposed to be there." She looked at him. "You were supposed to be there," she said. He reached for her hand and held it. The fire moved. The wind moved outside. The children slept in the rooms down the hall. The mesa was cold and vast and starlit beyond the walls of the house, and the house was warm, genuinely warm inside and through. He said. "I understand that now." In the spring of 1890, when Thomas was nearly 5 and Clara was 2.5, Olive found she was carrying again, and this one arrived in November, another son, whom they named William after Edgar's father, and who came into the world with the red-faced energy of a person who has important things to do and is starting immediately. Edgar held William in the first hours of his life with the full ease of a man who has found that his capacity for love does not deplete but expands, and Olive watched him and felt the truth of this in herself as well. 3 children, 3 plates added to the 2 that had started everything. The table was crowded and noisy and wonderful, and on the evenings when the children were all fed and bathed and put to bed, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, Edgar and Olive sat together at that table with their coffee and talked in the low, easy voices of people who have said everything important to each other and can therefore say anything at all. They had disagreements. Of course they did. They were 2 people with strong characters and clear opinions, and the proximity of a shared life will always produce friction. They disagreed about money and about the cattle operation, and about the children and about any number of small domestic things, and they disagreed in the way of people who know each other fully directly, without cruelty, with the confidence that the disagreement is not a threat to anything essential, and they always resolved it. Not always immediately, not always easily, but always, because they had both come too far and given too much to let anything petty have the final word. Harlan Creek grew through those years. The railroad came through the county in 1888, 15 miles to the south, and the town felt the effect of it: more travelers, more commerce, more people settling the surrounding land. The school expanded and hired 2 teachers. A proper doctor set up practice on the main street. The Copper Spur Saloon was joined by a second establishment, and then a third, though Harlan Creek never became the kind of town that attracted the worst elements, partly because the community was tight enough and old enough to resist that transformation. Edgar became, in those years, one of the people the community turned to, not as a formal leader, but as the kind of person whose judgment is trusted because it has never been found wanting. When there were disputes between neighbors about water rights or fence lines, people came to Edgar. When there were questions about the cattle market or land valuation, Edgar's opinion was sought. He gave it with his characteristic plainness and without self-importance, and it was usually right, and the community knew it. Olive organized, in the winter of 1889, the founding of a small lending library in Harlan Creek, which was something the town had needed for a long time, and which she assembled from donations of books, traveling from property to property with a wagon and a list, collecting whatever people were willing to give and arranging it in a room behind the church that Chester Hale donated for the purpose. By the end of the first year, the library had 93 books and a system of borrowing and returning that worked on the honor system and mostly functioned beautifully. Ruth Garza ran it with her, and it became one of the things Harlan Creek was known for in the surrounding territory, a point of pride, evidence of a community that valued something beyond survival. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, June of 1894, Edgar and Olive were walking the fence line in the long summer evening, which was something they did regularly, walking the property together in the evenings, checking things, talking, being on the land together. Thomas was 9 and responsible enough to mind his younger siblings for a short time. Clara was 7 and very much in charge of the household whenever she was left in it, which concerned no one because she was competent beyond her years. William was 3 and largely devoted to the project of becoming as muddy as possible at all times. They walked along the east fence line, the fence that had once divided their two properties, the fence that existed now only as a legacy of the original surveys and had no real function. And the evening was warm and golden, and the mesa was lit from the west in the particular amber that New Mexico summer evenings produced. Edgar stopped at a point along the fence line where the repair he had made in their first month of knowing each other was still visible in the different color of the wood. He looked at it. "Right here," he said. Olive looked at it too. "Right here," she agreed. 10 years ago in the fall I was on that side," he said, gesturing east, "and you were on that side and you told me 3 of my cattle were in your garden." "They were eating my squash," she said. "I owed you a season of squash," he said. "You have made it up," she said. He turned to look at her. The 10 years were on both of them lines at the corners of their eyes, a few more silver strands in his hair, the kind of beauty that comes from being fully in a life. He looked at her with those open dark eyes, and the expression on his face was the same one she had first seen at that kitchen table in the November of 1883, when she had set the second plate down and he had sat across from her, as if the simple fact of being received was something almost too large to hold. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you." "I think about what this would have been," he said, gesturing at the whole of the evening, the property, the house visible behind them with the warm lamplight in the windows, the sound of children from inside. "If you had not come, if Thomas had left this place to someone else or no one." "Do not think about that," she said. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "not with worry, with gratitude, with the specific gratitude of someone who knows how differently it could have gone." She took his arm and they stood together on the fence line in the evening, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm. "It went right," she said. "It went right," he said. The mesa was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of the life of the place. The cattle in the pasture, the chickens in their coop, the 3 children in the warm house, the root cellar full of the summer's first harvest, the kitchen garden planted and growing, the sky above the territory enormous and blue and absolutely infinite in the long summer dusk. Olive Blackwell had come to Harlan Creek on a buckboard with a cracked wheel and a tired mule and 40 acres, and a leaking house, and a list of things that needed doing that was longer than her arm. She had done every one of them. And she had done something else, something that had not been on any list, something she had not known to plan, for she had set 2 plates on a table on a November evening in 1883, for a man who had not sat across from another person in 6 years, and she had done it without asking and he had not objected. And from that small, ordinary, revolutionary act everything else had followed. Edgar Stone had spent 6 years behind a door. The door was open. It had been open for 11 years. The life on the other side of it was full and warm and real and ongoing, and it contained, at last, after everything, every good thing. Their 4th child, another son they named James after Olive's father, arrived in the spring of 1896, healthy and loud and immediately adored by his older siblings, who had opinions about his management that he would spend his early years vigorously resisting. Edgar held James in the first hours and looked at Olive over the baby's head with a look that said everything, a look she had seen 100 times and still found extraordinary, and she reached up and touched his face and said nothing because there was nothing to say that was not already perfectly said by the fact of them. Here, in this room, in this life, in the territory that had given them to each other. The sun came through the bedroom window the next morning and fell across the bed where Olive was resting and the cradle where James slept and the chair where Edgar sat. And Edgar looked out the window at the property, his and hers and theirs, all the same thing now, and felt the particular quality of a man who has arrived, completely, at the place he is supposed to be. Outside, Thomas was doing morning chores at the barn. his 9-year-old face set with the seriousness of assigned duty. Clara was in the garden. William, too, was somewhere nearby, inevitably muddy. The chickens were producing. The cattle were in the east pasture. The kitchen garden was coming into its spring abundance. The table inside had 4 plates on it from breakfast, and there were 2 coffee cups still warm from the morning, one on each side. 2 cups, 2 plates, the plates that had started everything. The simplest possible thing in the world, room made for another person, and from the making of it, the whole world. Edgar Stone sat in the chair by the window and watched the morning come over the mesa, and he was, all the way through, without reservation or qualification or the shadow of the sealed door, happy. And in the spring of that year, and in every year that followed, the table in the Blackwell Stone house had never fewer than 2 plates on it. There was always room. There had been room from the very first moment, and there would be room forever. And the woman who had known this before it was said and had simply acted on it, without asking, without waiting for permission, was the reason for all of it. She was the reason for all of it, and Edgar Stone knew this, and he told her so in the plain and certain language that was his, across the table and across the fence line and across the years. And she received it with the steady green eyes and the capable hands and the composure that was not distance but its opposite, the composure of someone who is completely, fully, utterly present. This was how it was. This was how it stayed. The territory stretched wide around the house, and the house was warm, and the table had 2 plates at its center and more on either side, and the people at it were well and loved and known, and the life being lived inside those walls was the life they had built together from the ground up, from the cracked wheel and the tired mule and the leaking roof, and the cold November evening when a woman had taken down 2 plates from a shelf and set them on a table without asking, and a man had crossed the room and sat down. And the rest was every day that followed, every one.